In the year 1099, the Crusader army, fueled by a toxic mix of religious fervor and bloodlust, massacred nearly 3,000 Muslim and Jewish civilians in a single day, marking one of the most horrific events in human history. The streets of Jerusalem ran red with blood as the Crusaders, who had been marching towards the city for years, finally breached its walls and unleashed a maelstrom of violence upon its inhabitants. This brutal act of carnage was not an isolated incident, but rather a symptom of a much larger and more complex phenomenon, the Crusades, a series of holy wars that would go on to shape the course of human history in profound and devastating ways. As we delve into the dark truth about the Crusades, it becomes clear that these wars were not simply a clash of civilizations, but a calculated campaign of conquest and domination, driven by a toxic cocktail of religious zealotry, economic greed, and imperial ambition. The Crusades were sparked by a call to arms from Pope Urban II, who in 1095 preached a sermon in Clermont, France, urging Christians to take up the cross and reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim rule. But beneath the veneer of religious piety, the Crusades were also driven by a desire for wealth, power, and territory, as European nobles and knights sought to expand their dominions and enrich themselves through plunder and conquest. As the Crusader armies marched towards the Holy Land, they left a trail of destruction and devastation in their wake, slaughtering thousands of innocent civilians, including women, children, and the elderly. The Crusaders saw themselves as the instruments of God's will, and they believed that they were entitled to destroy anyone who stood in their way, including Muslims, Jews, and even fellow Christians who refused to submit to their authority. The city of Anjou, which was besieged by the Crusaders in 1097, was a prime example of this brutality, as the Crusaders massacred thousands of its inhabitants, including many who had taken refuge in the city's mosques and churches. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Crusades is the way in which they were justified and rationalized by the church and the nobility. The Crusaders were told that they were fighting a holy war, and that their actions were sanctioned by God Himself. This ideology of holy war was used to justify even the most heinous atrocities, including the massacre of civilians, the destruction of cities, and the enslavement of prisoners. The Crusaders were also encouraged to see themselves as martyrs, who were willing to sacrifice their lives for the sake of their faith, and this mindset helped to create a culture of violence and extremism that would have far-reaching consequences. As the Crusades dragged on for centuries, they became increasingly brutal and destructive, with the Crusaders committing atrocities that would be considered war crimes today. The siege of Jerusalem in 1099, which we mentioned earlier, was just one example of this brutality, but there were many other incidents of mass slaughter, rape, and pillage that took place throughout the Crusades. The Crusaders also developed a range of barbaric tactics, including the use of torture, mutilation, and forced conversion, which were used to break the spirits of their enemies and to extract confessions and concessions from them. Despite the horrific nature of the Crusades, they have often been romanticized and sanitized in popular culture, with many historians and scholars downplaying or ignoring the worst atrocities committed by the Crusaders. However, the facts are clear. The Crusades were a series of brutal and devastating wars that resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, and which had a profound and lasting impact on the course of human history. The Crusades also helped to create a culture of antisemitism and Islamophobia that would persist for centuries, and which would have far-reaching consequences for Jewish and Muslim communities around the world. As we reflect on the dark truth about the Crusades, it is clear that these wars were not simply a product of their time, but rather a symptom of a much deeper and more complex disease, a disease of intolerance, hatred, and violence that has plagued human societies for centuries. The Crusades may be a distant memory, but their legacy continues to haunt us today, in the form of ongoing conflicts and tensions between different religious and cultural groups. The Crusades also serve as a stark reminder of the dangers of extremism and fundamentalism, and the importance of promoting tolerance, understanding, and peaceful coexistence in our increasingly globalized and interconnected world. In the end, the Crusades remain a haunting and disturbing chapter in human history, a reminder of the darkest aspects of human nature and the dangers of unchecked power and ideology. As we look back on these brutal and devastating wars, we are forced to confront the darkest corners of our own humanity, and to ask ourselves how such atrocities could have been committed in the name of God and faith. The answer, unfortunately, is that the Crusades were not an aberration, but rather a reflection of a much deeper and more profound sickness, a sickness that continues to afflict us today, and which we must confront and overcome if we are to create a more just and peaceful world.